Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi and welcome to the ISO Show. Thanks very much for joining me today. We're going to be talking all things ISO 22716 today, and that's a standard that you may not have heard of, and that's probably because it's a niche standard for a specific industry. So ISO 22716 is the standard for cosmetics manufacturing. It's the good manufacturing practices standard that supports all businesses that produce goods in cosmetics. And actually, when you think about it, it's covering, soaps, hand washes, through to makeup, face masks, dentistry products. So you name it, it's covered under 22716. And you might be thinking, well, why are we covering this? Because it's such a niche standard, and all the other standards we've covered have been pretty much, affected all different types of organisations. But the reason for bringing this up is because this is one of the most popular standards that we get inquiries about on our website, on the blackmoresuk.com website. And we are specialists in this particular standard, and we thought it would be worthwhile, sharing information about the standard. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Derek Hall, MBE, who is one of our consultants here at Blackmores. And he's going to be sharing some insights over the next couple of episodes on the cosmetics manufacturing standard. Hi, Derek.
Hi, Mel. Thanks for the introduction.
Great. Well, it's good to have you back. I know it's been a while. I think it was probably over a year ago now when you were sharing insights into ISO 14001, the environmental standard. So, this is a standard that's been around for some time. And it's actually quite unusual in that there is an EU directive that's really pushing this. So there are a lot of regulatory and legislative requirements associated with this particular industry. So although it's a niche subject, it's a fascinating one. And actually, I think there are quite a lot of aspects to this standard that could be applied to any manufacturing organisation. So great. So let's kick off then, Derek. So let's start with looking at what ISO 22716 actually is.
Okay, thank you, Mel. 22716, it's built on a series of clauses which I'll go through with you in a minute. But I not only want to look at the clauses, I want to look at probably some of the core elements. So 22716, it offers a solid foundation for ensuring quality and safety and enables manufacturers, suppliers, retailers and wholesalers to minimise or eliminate incidents of contamination, really important. Any mix-ups or other errors that can affect product quality.
Great, thanks very much for that explanation, Derek. So these guidelines have been prepared by the cosmetics industry, for the cosmetics industry, I believe, obviously taking into account the specific needs of this sector. So what sort of thing does it cover, Derek?
Well, the guidelines actually cover and give practical advice, actually, on the management of human, technical and administration factors affecting product quality. It's also built on scientific judgment and risk assessments. So it doesn't mean, though, you have to be scientists to implement it. Thought I'd put that point across. But it is based on, or it's very much based on facts and showing specific evidence.
Great. So in terms of the clauses then, Derek, within the standard, I'm guessing that there is some commonality there with other standards like ISO 9001 and even possibly ISO 45001, the health and safety standard. But could you just walk us through the clauses, please?
Yeah, there's 17 clauses, believe it or not. But it's quite logically laid out. So, for example, I'm going to talk through them now. The first clause is scope, so scope of your activities. Then it talks about terms and definitions, and in many standards that tends to get glossed over, but it's quite important, or very important within this standard, that you understand some of the definitions behind things. Then there's personnel, premises, equipment, raw materials and packaging materials, production, finished products. There's also quality control laboratory. Now, I'm going to probably come back to that, but it doesn't mean you have to have a product quality laboratory, but it's an important factor within the process. Then there's a treatment of product that is out of specification. Any waste. So waste actually could align with anything to do with ISO 14001 if you've got an environmental system. Subcontracting. Subcontracting is a big area that needs to be looked at. So in terms of, for instance, if you haven't got a laboratory, you'd need to subcontract it out. Then you've got deviations, any deviations within the process. Complaints or recalls is the next clause, clause 14. Then you've got change control. So what changes have you had within your processes? Internal audits. So you need to carry out an internal audit program. And then, very importantly, documentation. And documentation will go through all of these clauses.
That's fantastic. Thanks for taking us through all 17 clauses briefly. I know there were just the headlines there. But actually, I mean, isn't that a great blueprint for any organisation that wants to start up a new business in cosmetics manufacturing? And also for those organisations that may have been operational for many years and are doing a great job, they're selling products, but they'd like to raise their standards. That literally walks you through an entire framework for running that business. And I remember when COVID first hit back in 2020, we got a huge number of inquiries from organisations that were already doing something in the manufacturing industry, but they wanted to get into, for example, antibacterial hand washes and sprays and things like that. But they needed to get this standard in order to be able to do it. And I know that for some organisations, this standard was invaluable. So I know that we've got the 17 clauses there, but could you try and break down that into some kind of core elements, if that's okay, Derek?
Yeah, in terms of core elements, you could broadly divide the standard into personnel, premises and equipment, operations and materials management, quality control, and also your cosmetics quality management system. Now that last point actually might have some alignment with any quality standards you have in place, for instance, ISO 9001. Similarly, going backwards on this, on the operations part we were talking about, that relates to probably clause 8 of ISO 9001. So there's another correlation there.
Great. You've just answered a question I was about to ask you then, Derek, which is how does that interlink with ISO 9001? So thanks for explaining that. So let's dive into some of those core elements in a bit more detail then. Starting off with the first one that you mentioned, which is personnel.
So with personnel, the standard, let's go back to the standard. The standard is quite specifically laid out. Like a lot of standards, they'll ask a straight question and you need to provide evidence. So for instance, the standard in terms of personnel talks about controls of eating food and drinking beverages. It talks about they should be restricted to appropriate designated areas away from storage and processing areas. Really important because you can contaminate the product that you're producing if people are eating. So there is a real reason for that. Personnel and visitors should be properly supervised while in the manufacturing facility. So quite often you can have customers visiting your site. They need to understand some of the controls in place and where they can go and where, they can't. But that needs to be explained and the reasons for it to be explained. There are other factors, for instance, that if you're wearing jewellery or you've got earrings maybe or other things like that, they need to be well controlled because, simple things like, a ring could drop off into a product that's been produced. So we're often asked, what about wedding rings, etc.? Well, no, wedding rings are usually fairly well attached, but, we need to make sure maybe you've got gloves on just to control that factor. And then only authorised personnel should be allowed access into production. So, people that are producing the goods should be allowed. People that aren't, if they're authorised, fine. But you should certainly have some good signage up. Notices about do not enter. Going back, notices about no food or beverages allowed beyond a certain point.
Yeah, so a lot of that is actually common sense, isn't it? And I think that's the main thing with these good manufacturing practices. But these are things that can easily get overlooked and taken for granted, which as an owner or managing director or director of operations, you can't afford for those silly little mistakes to happen. And so it's best to make sure that the controls are in place, they're clearly communicated, so that, you don't have any silly accidents that could quite easily be avoided. So the second point that you mentioned was premises and equipment. So do you need to have a high-tech premises to be able to get ISO 22716, or again, is that common sense? And can you just kind of walk us through some of the requirements here?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it probably can vary from company to company on what you're producing, but generally you're producing a cosmetics product. That could be a dental product, it could be cosmetics pads, other beauty products. The machinery you use and the equipment you use and the layout of where you've got that equipment needs to be pretty well controlled, and you need to have programs for sanitisation in hand. For example, I think earlier you spoke about COVID. Now, that led us straight to, with present clients, re-looking at their controls in place and seeing how they could further improve them. Yeah, so it needs to be quite stringently controlled. And, you need to have programs in place for sanitisation. You need to have programs in place for cleaning. In terms of the premises itself, storage areas should be pretty well controlled. You should have proper access and flow of materials. So, for instance, if you've got machinery and you're using that machinery, there shouldn't be a lot of clutter around the machinery. It should be very well controlled. And to save any faults occurring or any accidents occurring. So again, as Mel was saying, it's common sense, but common sense doesn't always prevail. Also, in terms of premises, we've got pest control. Now, pest control, you won't find anything, I don't think, about pest control in the quality standard ISO 9001.
No, I don't think there is.
No. But here you get into some of the differences. With pest control, it's got to be stringently controlled. So you might have heard the term minor non-conformity, major non-conformity. Well, if you haven't got, for instance, say, if you've got roller shutter doors in a factory and you've got gaps on those roller shutter doors and there are dangers of rodents getting within there, that can result in a major non-conformity being raised. Because, pretty obviously, rodents equal contamination of products. So the factory layout and the premises has to be pretty tightly controlled. Now, you might well have pest control measures in place, that's what we would be expecting to see. But it also covers, and reading the standard now, this is clause 14.13/1, premises should be designed, constructed and maintained so as to restrict access to insects, birds, rodents, pests and other vermin. So pretty specific clause. There also, the next clause down, it talks about there should be a pest control program in place appropriate to the premises. And then the next clause from then, it talks about measures to be taken to control the exterior of the premises to prevent attracting or harbouring pests. So you could be on a trading estate, so how well are the controls outside the building? So there's another area that needs looking at.
So that's something to consider when you're looking for a new premises, I'm guessing, Derek, and a lot of new businesses are coming into this market at the moment. But I think that's true for any type of manufacturing organisation as well, where you're producing goods. You want to prevent contamination regardless, don't you? Whether it's cosmetics or, it could be food production, it could be many other aspects as far as manufacturing is concerned. So then, of course, there's the equipment as well, isn't there?
I mean, there are principles built in this standard. I know you can't see the standard, but there are principles ahead of each clause. So clause 5.1 principle, it says if automated systems are introduced into activities described in these guidelines, they should take into account the application of the given relevant principles. Now, that's quite a heavy number. I'm not going to talk through that too deeply there, but you need to make sure you've got processes in place to control your automated systems. Or you could have manual systems, but again, it's the same thing. You need to have controls on that equipment.
So does that include the cleaning and sanitation controls as well?
Correct, yeah. So there should be sanitisation should be controlled. There should be a proper program in place to avoid the occurrence of mix-ups and cross-contamination.
So you mentioned earlier on about Clause 8 in ISO 9001, which is obviously focusing on operational controls. And that was the next area that you mentioned earlier, following on from premises and equipment. So it's the actual operational control of that environment and the materials used, I believe.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, broadly speaking, it's about materials management. How well do you control your materials? It's about the manufacturing operations. It's about packaging operations. You've just produced a product, you need to pack it. How good are your packaging controls? You then need to store it or store the products. So how good's your storage? And then you need to ship them out. So you've got, delivery, etc. So you've got those processes. But linked to that, you've got things like purchasing, receipts, you've got release, you've got storage and re-evaluation of storage. You've got documentation and process controls. You've got to also consider stock turnover, inventory to ensure stock reliability. So many of the people and clients I deal with have got sort of a fair amount of stock in place. We'd always be checking that stock is in date. So you could have chemicals that might have a sell-by date of a year. You could have materials, similar sort of situation. So that whole area needs a lot of control. And yes, as Mel was saying, it will interact with ISO 9001. And more recently, in fact, I've been on an external audit, or we've had external assessors come in and audit under 9 and 22716. And this is the biggest area because it's the operations. So this is the biggest area.
So in terms of materials management then, I think for any organisation it makes sense to optimise the use of your materials from a financial perspective, operational efficiency, because then ultimately you're going to be more productive with the materials that you're using in theory, and also reducing your costs, your overhead costs, your materials that you're using, therefore giving greater profitability. So it's not just about quality control, is it? You're also looking at this from a financial perspective. So could you provide some examples on how you can manage that criteria around the materials?
I mean, the criteria I'm sort of looking at the moment, I'm looking at a little check sheet from one of the companies that I deal with. And it's literally that. It's not rocket science. It's about checking the quality of what you're doing. The date when the material to come in, the stages of manufacturing, when it was produced, the specifications, the components of raw and packaging materials. So criteria checks are really, really important. Because also with criteria checks, you should have release parameters and looking at how good those release parameters are. So, for example, if you've got faults within that process, they should be discovered there and then while the operator's producing the goods. Because then that's your check, and that's the check to know whether the goods meet the standard required. So it's really, really important. And of course, then it's very visible as well. This is what I'd call a very physical standard. It's very much show me some evidence of checks that take place. How are those checks taking place? What was your criteria for those checks? And so on. So it's a really important part of it. And again, it will link to documentation because again, documentation is of utmost importance. In whatever form it is, electronic documentation or physical documentation, you need to show evidence that you've checked what you're producing.
So you mentioned about a checklist. So, there is a good book called the Checklist Manifesto that I've heard about. I haven't got around to reading it. I was listening about it on a podcast the other day and I thought, actually, as a quality professional, I should probably check that book out. Well, yeah, you can't go wrong with a good old checklist, can you, Derek? And
no.
it doesn't matter how knowledgeable or experienced you are. I think one of the stories behind this book was the fact that, a surgeon can actually get things wrong, unfortunately, because there are so many things that they need to remember and to do. And as a team, of people that are involved with an operating theatre, performing a piece of surgery, you only need one thing that you miss out that could go wrong. And I know this is very different, producing cosmetics manufacturing, product, but at the end of the day, the same principles apply. You've got to check that everything is as it should be, ranging from the temperature even of some of those products. So I know that obviously in recent years, there's been a growing demand in organically based products and using fresh ingredients for products and plant-based materials as well. So is it fair to say that, you need to look at all the different types of materials that you need, look at the conditions for all of those, and then have areas within the premises for things like acceptance of it, whether it has been checked and it's okay to use, or if not, that it could be rejected or even quarantined?
Yeah, no, it's very true. The whole checking process, remember checking is also an historical document. So 6 months after you produce something, you can have a complaint come in. So if you've got a complaint, how do you know that the product you produced was right? So it's really important, from that perspective as well. And in terms of organic and natural-based products, and I'll talk about this on a future presentation, which is to do with regulation. There's another standard that we could go into a little bit more on natural organic products. But certain clients that I deal with also deal with organic and natural products. So, there's a whole array of different areas that can be looked at within this standard.
Great. So before we move on to operational controls then, Derek, anything else at all on materials that you'd like to add?
Yes, certainly the standard is talking, and I said earlier, about storage and handling to prevent mistakes, so mix-ups and errors. So contamination with microorganisms and other chemicals, degradation and exposure to excessive environmental conditions, heat, cold, sunlight, moisture, etc. So your storage areas and warehouse areas, again, you need to look into them into some depth on how effective they are. And again, Mel spoke earlier about saving money. This is also really about saving money. but you've got to have the controls in place to make sure you are saving that money.
Which leads us nicely on to operational controls. Thanks for that, Derek.
Yeah. Well, may I add one other point? I think you spoke about rejection and quarantine. You need to have, in the storage areas, you need to have probably a quarantine area. So you need to isolate anything that might be a faulty product. Because obviously nothing's perfect. So you might have errors, but you need to have them isolated. That's right. So in terms of operations, I mean, taking the standard, in fact, it's quite, as I said before, it's quite well laid out. So operations should be carried out according to manufacturing documentation, including A, suitable equipment, B, formula for the product, C, list of all raw materials identified according to relevant documents indicating batch numbers and quantities. Yes, so documentation should include detailed manufacturing operations for each stage. For instance, the addition of raw materials, temperature, speeds, mixing times, sampling. The list goes on. But it will depend on what you're actually producing. So some of this will be relevant, some of it might not be relevant. My guess, though, is most of it will be, and certainly things like sanitisation of equipment, because that keeps coming up throughout the standard, the word sanitisation. So cleanliness, sanitisation is really important part of operations and control.
Yes, that ties in beautifully with quality control, doesn't it? Which I know is it's at the heart of this standard. And I think that's why, based on, having dealt with this standard over the years, this is the thing that's really, really driving the demand for manufacturing companies to have this standard in place because of the high standards of quality control. So can you just break this down for us, Derek, and share a bit more insight into the quality control aspect of the standard?
So to break it down, I suppose what you're looking at sampling, you're looking at specification testing. You're also looking at out of specification investigation, and then you're looking at release. So it's really important to cover those factors. Now, I think I said earlier, you might not have a quality control laboratory. This can tend to happen on certain organisations haven't got the facility for that. So what they'll be doing is sending out or subcontracting that service. But what we'd expect to see is that some sort of proof that the laboratory has carried out the tests. So we'll be looking at things like certificates of analysis to make sure they've checked the product and checked the formula. For example, we deal with a toothpaste manufacturer and they will send out their products, or their formulas rather, for testing. So it has to meet stringent testing requirements. And those in turn have to meet requirements for dentistry practices, the general dentist practice for instance, and they have to meet various other regulations. So it's really important on this part, you've got it controlled, using the word controlled. If you've got a quality control laboratory, we'll be looking through all sort of areas on what you do. So we'll be looking at water quality, for example. We're looking at formulas. But I don't want to get too deeply into scientific matters.
So you mentioned about subcontractors. So that could be a huge benefit for an organisation, but also a risk as well. Because obviously your suppliers are going to vary, aren't they, in terms of quality control. Is there anything in particular that you'd recommend in relation to dealing with subcontractors?
Yeah, probably we'll talk about this on a future presentation, but in terms of subcontractors, it comes under Clause 12 of the standard. And Clause 12 of the standard talks about manufacturing, and it talks about packaging, it talks about analysis, cleaning and sanitisation, pest control, equipment and premises maintenance. They're all areas that you could subcontract out. So in terms of subcontracting then, you'd need a written contract with whoever you're using, whatever company you're using. So you need a written contract or agreement. It's a key point here. You don't have to have a written contract, but you have to have some sort of written agreement. So that's what we'd be expecting to see. Now, written agreements can come in many forms, but we'd expect to see some control, because if you're sending out a key part of the process, call it the laboratory activities, you need to make sure that your contract covers that quite specifically. So there's probably two elements to contractors or contracting. One is the contract giver. You, the company, are the giver. You're giving a contract to somebody. But then you've got the contract acceptor, so the supplier, the person or the organisation carrying out that activity. You need to make sure you've got the means and experience and competent personnel, the acceptor does. An interesting part of this, and this is where it gets quite specific, it says here, the contract acceptor should not pass to a third party any of the work entrusted to them in the contract without the contractor giver's prior approval and consent. So really important that whoever you're contracting out to, you need to make sure that if they are further subcontracting it out, you need to make sure that that process is controlled. And there are other elements to this, but we can talk about that in future times. Moving on, deviations. Deviations can happen anywhere within an organisation. So you could have deviations in your packaging operation. You can have deviations in storage, in shipment. You could have complaints and recalls, materials management, and just the manufacturing operation. So deviations can appear anywhere within the operation. So it's really important that you monitor where potential deviations might lie. And then that leads into complaints and recalls. So you can have various complaints, like most organisations will have complaints, and this is where there's probably an analogy with ISO 9001, complaints monitoring. You need to have processes in place, and many organisations have standard operating procedures to cover any complaints or any recalls that they might have. And any product recall, you need to actually test the process for product recall. So periodically, let's say 6 monthly, maybe yearly, you need to look at your product recall processes.
Thanks, Derek. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier on when you were talking about quality controlling and batch numbers, etc., that's where it makes it really worthwhile in having clearly identified products right throughout the entire manufacturing process so that you can recall at any stage. And obviously, no organisation is perfect. There will be deviations and there will be changes that will be required as well. And I know that this particular standard, that there is a requirement for change control and procedures. Could you just explain why that's so important with this particular standard, Derek?
Yeah, change control, it's an interesting one. I don't think you'll specifically find this under 9001. But change control is really important to safeguard product quality and safety. So change control is making sure you've got effective processes in place and maintaining effective documentation. So there could be, you might want to change part of your operations. So you might have new machinery coming in, for instance, newer, faster machinery. That's a change. That's a change to the process. So how well controlled is that? Or you might be relying on slower machinery. You might have to install standby machinery maybe. I don't know. There are lots of different changes that can happen in an organisation. You might have a new department built. What control have you got over these changes? Because that department might have an impact on the rest of the operations. So it's quite a small sort of clause in the standard, but it's quite an important number, let's say.
So just coming up to the end of those core elements then, you mentioned earlier on about internal audits, and as we know, internal audits is a mandatory requirement of many ISO standards. Is this standard ISO 22716 any different at all?
Fundamentally not, no. It's very similar to 9001. You need to have an internal audit process, program in place. And it's really important that you've got competent personnel, significant designated competent personnel. They should be independent. And very similar to 9001, you need to show their independence when carrying out audits, etc. So the audits could be carried out by, there could be a service that you subcontract out, and then that particular company will come in and audit your processes. Or you could handle it internally. Or a lot of our clients, we've got a mixture of things actually. We've got clients that carry out their own internal audits and I'll run the overall audit program for them. So it's quite a broad area, let's say. But it depends on how you see audits and what benefits you want to get from them. But obviously the main benefit from audits is to discover gaps in the operations.
Yeah, always really effective for identifying opportunities for improvement. I love a good old internal audit.
Oh, no.
Right, so last but not least is the documentation. So undoubtedly there will be a requirement to demonstrate evidence of compliance to this standard and to be able to share with all employees your ways of working, your quality management system, all the controls that we've been talking about today. So if we just end there, Derek, on documentation, and we'll close with that if that's all right.
Yeah, in terms of documentation, yes, it's clause 17, that's the final clause. But actually, I think I said earlier, it's threaded all the way through. You need to have documentation in any form, let's say electronic or physical, call it documentation, that shows evidence that processes are being effectively carried out. So internal audits, we just spoke about that. You need to have proof that audits have taken place. You need to have information about any sort of errors, that have been discovered within the process. And what I'd like to see is when you're carrying out or looking at operations, I'd like to see that you've got good operational and probably visual documentation in place. So it's quite handy to be able to see that the operators on the shop floor clearly understand the need for the documentation and clearly see what the process is. So, yeah, a lot of visual process maps, etc., are always very handy.
That's great. Well, thanks very much for giving us a bit of a whistle-stop tour of all 17 clauses of ISO 22716 and a summary of what the general manufacturing practice document actually is. So that's been brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Derek.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Well,
you're going to be back again, Derek. Because there's a few other things that we need to talk about on 22716. And So I'm looking forward to the next episode where we're going to be talking about some of those regulatory drivers that we touched upon, that this standard, unlike others that we've come across, does have. Certainly in Europe, if any organisation in Europe wants to be able to produce manufacturing goods, they have to have a GMP in place in alignment with 22716. And it's a fascinating area. I know it might be a little bit dull for some, but obviously we can't underestimate, how important these regulatory requirements are in the industry. And so it'd be good to touch base with you on that. And then hopefully we can talk about, some of the benefits as well that you've seen that can be derived from having a GMP in place that's been implemented in alignment with ISO 22716. So we've got all of that to look forward to, and a few tips from Derek as well. Some top tips on implementing 22716 will be coming up in another episode as well. We've actually got a bit of a mini-series going on whilst we've got Derek. We're not letting him go until he's covered all aspects of ISO 22716 for those of our ISO show listeners that are actually interested in this particular topic. But actually, when we were discussing, going through those clauses, I was just thinking at the back of my mind that this is pretty relevant to most manufacturing organisations, isn't it? So it doesn't necessarily just need to be restricted to cosmetics. I think there's a lot to be said for quality management system for this sector.
No, very much so. And it could be related Mel's already touched on it. It could be related to environmental matters, quality matters. It could be linked with lean manufacturing that we haven't spoken about. So many areas where it could be connected with.
Great. Well, I look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of the ISO show. Thanks very much for listening.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.